This is Changeling the podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Changeling the podcast. I'm Josh, your host, and also hosting with here is Puka. Say hello, Puka.
Greetings.
So today's episode, we are going to look at Changeling before Changeling the Dreaming. Essentially, Faeries in the World of Darkness before the first edition Changeling the Dreaming book came out, and related games and topics. Puka, would you like to? Let's see. You had some ideas on this.
I have so many ideas on this.
Yeah. We're gonna. So there's first of all, there's going. What was the World of Darkness, especially at the beginning, and what that meant? So, do you have some thoughts on that, Puka?
Yeah. Well, and I feel very, very passionately about this topic because, as I mentioned before, Vampire was my first World of Darkness game, and that sort of encapsulates the whole World of Darkness ethos to an extent. It's hard to look at any of the other World of Darkness games, I think, without relating them back to Vampire at least a little bit, because I think that's, when they created them, that was what they did. Everything had to somehow connect back to that initial, concept.
Especially early Vampire.
Oh, yeah. Oh, very much so. And it's funny because even though, even from the start, it was very clear that they envisioned this world that was full of all these different supernatural beings, like werewolves were in there from the start, ghosts were in there from the start. It seems like they really didn't plan it out very carefully. So they made the Vampire game and then just threw everything in without really thinking about what worked and what didn't.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things in Vampire that they highlight is what they call the gothic punk ethos. And it's sort of a combination of mood and theme, where you have that gothic, it's always nighttime. There's always a cool breeze or a chill wind, and there's leaves and papers scattered around, and everything's kind of grim, and the lights are flickering, and all of that sort of, I guess we would call it grimdark now, but also that element of romanticism that you get with like Gothic literature. So Anne Rice in atmosphere form. But then that punk sensibility of kind of challenging the status quo and making things your own and, fuck your authority, that kind of thing. So yeah, with that in mind, it kind of reframes the notion of fairies or changelings and how they fit into that world, because the happy-go-lucky, it's not the charming mischief kind of stuff. There's elements of that, but fundamentally, the fairies have a streak of darkness underneath them. When you look at the original source material, I mean, when you look at the old Vampire and Werewolf, and even into the early days of Mage, you kind of have this general rule. All of the vampires say, just avoid the fairies. Don't mess with the fairies. Fairies are bad news. And that's it. There's no, there's nothing specific. It's just avoid at all costs. And part of that, I guess, is because they hadn't been given stats in a systematic way in the game, but also it lends itself to that notion of the world being fundamentally a bleak and disturbing and uncertain place.
That makes a lot of sense, and it's hard to come up with much to say on that. But yeah, and definitely you can tell with like the inspirations that they're drawing from everything I've read, both actually in Changeling for the most part, and certainly before Changeling. There was a lot of the lightest it would get would be something like Midsummer's Night Dream, which is not that's still not a kid's story, right?
So. Not at all. Or when you look at like the old fairy tales, kind of the unbowdlerized grim fairy tales and people killing their children and eating them and people having their eyes pecked out and all of that sort of stuff. It's like, yeah, that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, they're going to play tricks on you, but you might not survive those tricks. That's the
Yeah. And I think it's also important to recognize part of why Vampire in particular was so popular was because this was radically different from the general RPG landscape at the time, the mainstream landscape. So you had Dungeons and Dragons, and you could have dark elements in there. I forget when Ravenloft came out, but I don't think it was. It might have been after World of Darkness, but I don't know. Dates escape me. But for the most part, D&D was much more, if not happy, at least upbeat in the sense that you were adventurers conquering enemies.
yeah. Ravenloft was 1983. Just
Okay, so long predates.
yes, but that's still one setting kind of
Yeah,
module thing.
yeah, and not everyone was playing Ravenloft, so
Oh, it wasn't even its own campaign setting until 1990. So
that's what I'm thinking of. All right, so roughly at the same time. And that
yeah,
notion of playing the monster that World of Darkness kind of built itself on, that extended to all of the, all of the games they conceptualized, all of the different monsters that were out there.
yeah, it's definitely the zeitgeist at the time in general. Media it wasn't just like
Mm-hmm.
musically and movies and everything. It had been really going in that direction when Vampire came out.
Maybe we should describe for anyone who's unaware of just kind of our sense, because I know we've talked about it, of what the old timeline of White Wolf looked like.
Oh, okay, yeah, history. Yeah, this is where.
History lesson.
So there was, yeah. So there's the game Ars Magica. Yeah, it was. I know White Wolf was a magazine originally,
Yes. Late
and I
80s.
don't remember what they focused on. Was it a lot of D&D? Was it like other
I think it was a
stuff?
variety of things, but I don't know if it was like game
Hmm.
reviews or just kind of game descriptions.
Yeah, this is not the comprehensive history of World of Darkness
No.
podcast. That's probably some other hosts would do that one.
Disclaimer, we are not professionally associated with any of the White Wolf staff. So all of this is
Yes.
speculation.
Yet neither are we historians. Or
Not professionally at least. But yeah, there was the well told, or frequently told at least, story of the merger between White Wolf as the magazine and Lion Rampant as the game publishing company doing Ars Magica. So one of the, I guess, sort of documents of Changeling would be Ars Magica Faeries, which came out in 1990 and presents fairies. Really, it's more of an antecedent to Dark Ages Fae than anything else. So we're getting way ahead of ourselves if we bring that in. But I think it does show, at least, in terms of the mood and theme again, what the initial idea of fairies, where that came from. Because they are the medieval, inscrutable, capricious, very powerful, and ultimately bad news fairies.
so that was right after. Ooh, that would have been before they
Well,
merged.
there's actually a note in the front matter of the book because I have it here in front of me. I was managed to secure a copy, and it says a note about our merger. So it was
Hmm.
in progress at the time the book came out.
Interesting. Okay. So yeah, that would have been still pretty early on, but yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, what are the fairies? Very quick, roughly. What are the fairies like in Ars Magica?
So there's a few different types. I would say the distinctions. I mean, this is really just I've only skimmed it. I haven't done a deep read or anything. Um, but they do reference the Tuatha De Danann, and I apologize for any native Irish speakers who might listen to this because I know that the pronunciation most players are familiar with doesn't necessarily correspond to the Irish. Um, but so they do kind of reference some of that Irish-based mythology as well as some Norse stuff because Ars Magica is localized in Europe, and you do see the distinctions between noble and commoner, and then sort of elemental versus, I guess, cultural archetypes. So you don't have inanime necessarily, but you have like forest fairies and water fairies as opposed to courtly fairies. So there are some of those early distinctions, but there's certainly no. There are courts, The book is subtitled, I think, A Guide to the Seelie. So the Seelie, at least, were established within that setting. Interestingly, though, I think one of the big pieces that matters for the old World of Darkness books is that Arcadia is very thoroughly described in the Ars Magica book and is accessible because it's set in Changeling terms. It's set pre-shattering, so Arcadia is still a place where one can go.
But it's not a region of Greece.
Correct. Well, that too, maybe, but there's different regions within it. So there's Somniare, which is the land of dreams, Atlantium, which is underwater Arcadia, Antrim, which is rock Arcadia, etc., etc. It's all very elementally divided.
But this is strictly an antagonist book?
I believe so. I mean, I'll admit I've never actually played Ars Magica, so.
but it's not like just like character creation section for making your fairies.
No. So there's descriptions of like the different. I shouldn't say there's no kiths, but it's like there are divisions. There are like descriptions of merfolk, and it's not like they just have a greater swimming speed. Otherwise, they're the same as other fairies. And there's gnomes who are earth fairies, and they might have access to earth spells. So it's all kind of within the mechanics of Ars Magica, which is more similar to Mage than anything else, I believe.
Ooh, look! According to I'm just looking at the PDF here. According to the table of contents, there are fairy PC rules.
Yeah,
so that's exciting.
I obviously did not scroll down that far yet.
Yep. So that's exciting.
Yeah. Well, now I want to play a game with this. See how it measures up to Changeling.
Yes. I'll just cross it over with Dark Ages Fae one day. That should work fine. I'm sure somebody's tried porting. I know they ported Ars Magica to modern day as like an alternative Mage. Somebody's done that.
Which was, of course, the initial intention for... So yeah, just to return to the history, after Vampire, I think we had a conversation the other day where I gave my opinion that Werewolf is kind of the meta World of Darkness game, because World of Darkness set itself up on, you can play the monster. And then once they had done that, it's like, well, who's the monster to the monster? Let's have you be able to play that too. So like having the Lupines as an antagonist from the start for Vampire meant that the Werewolf game obviously would have to follow hard on its heels. And then Mage was already kind of in the air as a successor, a modern day sort of Ars Magica. So those three from the start seem to have all kind of germinated together. Or at least that's my sense.
Yes. Yeah, there was definitely werewolves versus vampires before. That wasn't a White Wolf invention or ours.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Plus, Werewolf has, with the spirit world and stuff, has more expansive, otherworldly stuff than Vampire would have had. And then there wasn't that much expansion beyond that, really. I guess Change would be the biggest one after that.
Well, and as we've done some digging into the history, we've been trying to pinpoint exactly when Changeling and Wraith in particular were first kind of floated as their own individual lines, because neither splat is mentioned in the earliest Vampire books, but then they are mentioned in the second edition ones and the early Werewolf books. So somewhere in the end of 1991, early 1992, they seem to have been formally introduced into the setting. And then by 92, they were already being listed as upcoming games.
But still, you can definitely see that they were very good. They were planning on very different games.
Right.
Especially for Changeling / Fairy.
Yeah. Fairy, as it used to be known.
So yeah, do you have any more? I guess we can go into how that evolved over time.
Yeah, I have a few excerpts that I can just talk about briefly, because the fairies do appear beyond the sort of passing mentions of Avoid the Fairies that you get in like clan books, even early like Mage supplements. It's just kind of like yeah they're a thing. Give them some sphere dots.
And since they had, you had the definite ties of Ars Magica from the beginning of Vampire with the Tremere and whatnot. Wouldn't be surprising that they would have thought, even in the first book, hey, we might have fairies somehow in this game, even if it's not really fleshed out at all.
Yeah. Do you know what's funny? Clanbook Tremere it's another one of those things where it just has the passing mention. It's like 2 sentences of, steer clear of the fairies. And yet all of the other, well, not all of the other, but several other sources are like, we hear the Tremere have dealings with them. The Tremere don't seem to think so. So that was House Marinita's stuff.
Yeah, I think there's even changeling sources with the Hermetics like that later on.
Yeah. So some of the more substantial references, the earliest major one that I could find was in the first edition Vampire Storytellers Handbook, which was early 92. And that actually does have the first fairy with stats in the entire game. They have large amounts of chemistry and protean, which for any non-vampire players is basically illusions and shapeshifting, as well as obfuscate and presence, so they can hide themselves and enchant people, and auspex to have all sorts of clairsentient knowledge. And the stat block is for Fairy Kidnapper. So the Fairy Kidnapper has come to our reality in hopes of capturing the characters, whether he needs them as warriors in a great battle, prizes in a scavenger hunt, or attractions at a new zoo. He will hunt them and his other prey down and bring them back to Arcadia with him. So that kind of sums it up, and it's really a lot more in line with those traditional myths, and kind of in line with Changeling the Lost more than Dreaming, in the sense of visiting the realm to steal some vampires.
Yeah.
So
I mean, that's definitely a folklore all over the place, kind of. One of the things we would call fairies from different cultures, one of the things they do is kidnap people, so.
Yeah. They do reference the Unseelie and the Seelie at this point. They have notes like, the few kindred that have ventured into Arcadia have never returned. They mention that the results of drinking fairy blood are not constant. Sometimes the kindred will be filled with great power, and other times the drinker will become lost in a land of hallucinations. Sometimes it acts as poison, and other times as water. So from the start, we do get that fairy blood is weird to drink.
Yep.
And they mention that some fairies live here permanently, making their homes in out-of-the-way places where humans are unlikely to bother them. So the notion of changelings in the sense of fairies essentially wearing human bodies to deal with banality is pretty absent from this.
Yes.
And I do wonder when that started to be developed. I suppose that makes for a better player character to have that aspect.
Yeah. Well, we'll get into that as we go through the timeline.
Yeah.
I have some ideas on that. So do you have any other... Yeah. So there was like other minor mentions, right? Oh, the Chiacid, I guess, would be that's a big one.
Yeah. So the Chiacid, again, for any non-vampire players, are the bloodline associated with the vampire sect, the Sabbat, who are Fae-touched in some way. They experimented with their blood, and now they are sort of half fairy, half vampire. And their discipline, Mytherceria, is meant to be sort of Fae-connected. The original description of it, it's a lot more... in the revised version, it's a lot more associated with like manipulating memory and kind of befuddling people. But the original version has a lot to do with sort of earth magic. So you can do things like turn someone into stone, or excavate your way through the earth, or summon goblins, which are earth fairies. So that seems to be another sort of Ars Magica aspect that still lingered.
Yeah. I remember when I first encountered the Chiacid, it was before revised, and I was like, why is it fairy? What? But I'd already encountered changelings. So
This doesn't make any sense.
This made no sense to me. Yeah.
There's also, in Werewolf, there's a couple, I know I'm focusing a lot on vampire here, but in Werewolf, there's also some of that. In Rage Across New York, which came out in, I think, near the end of 1992, there's a brief description of fairy society in New York State. And it's the war between the Smooths and the Mottleds, which is a very weird sort of description.
Did one of them map to Seelie and the other to Unseelie?
Well, kind of. So smooth fairies look like slender humans and are considered very beautiful. The Mottleds are ugly, squat, and sometimes repulsive creatures. So it's a little bit Seelie on Seelie, or maybe even Seelie Shadow Court kind of distinction. But we get... two of the Mottleds called Gibber and Crepper, and they're possible antagonists for your werewolf pack running through the Adirondacks. So there's still that earth and mountain association, and there's even an image. They look a little bit like, small trolls.
challenge for the players out there: try to make that as a PC in Changeling: The Dreaming 20th Edition.
Accepted.
Yes. So okay, so there's the werewolf stuff. There's you did a lot of you have much more of the back catalog of early White Wolf books than I do. So
I like to scrapbook.
Yeah. Is there anything else up until 1994? Would you say on?
I have a couple more. So briefly, the Vampire Player's Guide in the second edition was early 93. I'm not sure if the first edition, which I couldn't get a copy of, has this. But there's the Fairy Affinity merit, which is a 2-point merit that allows vampires to enter Arcadia. Who knew? It was so simple.
Wow.
Provided they can find an entrance, that is. So.
Well, that's also a not unbalancing power at all to bring into your C20 crossover game.
Absolutely.
Vampire.
There's also the Fairy Lore secondary ability, and that has, among other specialties, the various realms of Arcadia that are spelled out in the Ars Magica book. So you can specialize in Somniare, the Land of Dreams, for when you go find that gate to Arcadia. In Clanbook Malkavian, the original, there is the level 7 obfuscate discipline power, Visit Fairyland, where the Malkavian can utterly disappear from the area and appear in Fairyland. From Fairyland, she can go anywhere on Earth she wishes to go, but first she has to pass the Fairy Keepers, who dislike capricious use of their land. So,
I mean, I find that being obfuscate oddly the most confusing part of it.
It's true. There's a reference elsewhere where they say vampires with very high auspex can sometimes visit Arcadia. So I'm not sure why that changed, but
well, one is like that would be you floating out a body, and the other one's you physically go there. But.
I suppose that makes sense. Yeah, I mean neither one makes sense, but
yes. I think the auspex makes slightly more sense.
Well, slightly. And then in the first edition Mage core book from summer of 93, which by that point I would assume they had at least kind of started to lay the groundwork for Changeling as a game. And we get a little bit of that with references to, when they're talking about the Void Engineers in particular, the moon landing in 1969 kind of opening the door to Arcadia. It's sort of spelled out here that Arcadia is on the moon, or actually it's most mages at least agree that Earth's moon, known as Arcadia, exists in the Tellurian outside Guise near Umbra. So
I think that has to have been in Changeling proper, why the moon landing was tied to it originally.
Right.
But then they sort of shifted the concept.
Yeah. Well, guess. There's this reference to when Neil Armstrong first set foot upon the moon, millions were finally shown evidence that the moon was a barren, lifeless place, not the realm of mystery it was believed to be. Although many still say the moon landing was filmed in a TV studio. Still, this landing, rather than strengthening the Technomancer's hold on the gauntlet, only opened a gateway to Arcadia, the land of the Faeries. The magic of the Fae-infected Earth, and the idea of space exploration quickly took the form of a sublime experience for human consciousness. So there's almost this Faeries are aliens vibe running under the surface here, and I, for one, am relieved that that has more or less fallen out of the conception of the Fae.
Oh. I never mentioned my early getting into World of Darkness, working on this complex crossover plot line that I never got to run because everyone I mentioned to as a possible player thought it was kind of batshit insane.
Oh no.
Or not worth but it involved the triad, like the Weaver from Werewolf, the Weaver, Worm, Wild. There's the three of those, but then there's also the Weird, which is the Dreaming / the Moon, which had the Thea hypothesis. Anyway, I got really...
You went deep.
Into a strange meta, and it involved like a immortal static wraith mage. Anyway, that...
I mean, I'm all for it.
Was the actual chronicle. Yeah, I was a teenager. Let's put it that way.
Oh, we all do things in our teenage years that we're not always proud of.
It's the things I did, in my 30s that I'm not proud of, that I have to be more careful about.
Those two. I think the last one I wanted to mention is Umbra the Velvet Shadow, which was the first Werewolf Umbra book from about the same time as the first Mage core book. And it details a number of realms in the Umbra that werewolves can visit, one of which is the Arcadia Gateway, which is ruled by Mariana, who I think is later said to be House Aelil. and Lord Lysander's another one of the characters there. But it very specifically says that this realm is not actually Arcadia. You can get to Arcadia from it. And at that point, it kind of starts to maybe make Arcadia into this more metaphysical, spiritual realm and not something on the moon. I believe the Arcadia Gateway has been updated into C20, like somewhere in the vast pages of the core book, there's a reference to it.
We'll get to that whenever we get to C20. That'll be a quick read.
Yeah. So there's that. And that one talks about the Seelie Court and the Unseelie Court and the High Fairies, Lord Lysander and Princess Mariana. So they're very clearly intended to be she, whereas there are low fairies also kind of skulking about the enchanted forests in the realm. So.
Okay. Yeah, I had 2 sources I found. One is a Masquerade 2nd edition, which was a early Mind's Eye Theater LARP book for Vampire. And one thing to keep in mind is back then the Mind's Eye Theater games were pretty distinct setting-wise from the tabletop. It was definitely much more vaguely inspired by than trying to cling closely to the same setting that you would have gotten, say, the revised era. But that one has an entry on talking. For some reason, all the other antagonists is like talk about which vampires encountered them. But this one says the Geru, even though they're called lupines in the lupine section, have encounter fairies. So it's like rumor of a rumor that they come from Arcadia and gives other names like the Otherworld and Tirnadog or whatever. My pronunciation's not great either. That they only enter the mortal world certain times of year, like Samhain. There's mental attributes, attributes were a big thing in that version of the LARP rules back then. They had strange forms of magic, and they were basically indestructible, but things like cold iron might banish them back to their own realm. So that, maybe less of a description of where things were going, since LARP was so distinct back then, but at least an interesting take on things.
Yeah.
And then the more on point would be that was in 1994. Also in 1994 was the Wraith 1st edition core book, which actually has a ad in the back for Changeling coming out summer of 1995, and also has stats on Changelings / Faeries, which they talk about in that one, in that point. It actually makes it seem like wraiths interact with fairies, which it implies are kind of like the true fae or whatever you want to call it in Changeling. They interact with them a lot. They're creatures composed of magic and spirit. And they do mention the nobles and commoners, mention actually some sort of dark fae called the Knights of the Poisoned Rose, which maybe has a connection, was picked up later as Kiramet, and travel between Arcadia and the lands of the dead. They do mention also something that sounds like the Shattering, but it's a bit different. There were fairies trapped on Earth after the Black Death. And these weren't changelings. These were maybe kind of like Lost Ones, except for they become insular, static, and conservative. And there's also changelings that have become so tainted by human blood, they sometimes forget what they are, but seem like they're like an aside thing that like wraiths don't really deal with unless they've died. So sometimes changelings dies, and but this one does seem to have the forgetting as a mechanic, even though it doesn't really have the mists as you think of it. And there is a stat block, references rules like the Shroud. They are creatures of spirit in this, but I mean it's explaining in terms of changeling. Gave them the different arcanoi for a noble, bunch of pretty powered stuff. One was like winter powers. Usually they specialize in one area. And then, changelings specialize in one area. And, basically the Fae can appear as all sorts of different humans of different ages and power and stuff. But that seems more like an illusion.
Makes sense.
Yeah. At least they're not indestructible like the LARP rules.
I'm curious. I mean, I know very little about Arcanoi, but when you say that they have powerful stuff, what does that look like?
So the one that they have says they generally, noble fairies, not changelings, generally have Argos 4, Keening 5, Lifeweb 3, Moliate 4, and Phantasm 5 All fairy powers must be united under a specific affiliation or potentiality. For example, a fairy allied with winter would have powers of cold, snow, and ice. So you'd sort of reskin the powers along. It sounds like you'd reskin the powers along whatever theme for that fairy.
Which is similar to, I think it's the Werewolf second edition core book, points to fairies being kind of thematic. So not necessarily just elemental, but kind of in the same way that werewolf spirits would be a winter spirit or a love spirit or, these very sort of conceptual things.
Mm-hmm.
Fairies seem to be almost more like spirits than anything else by that point in terms of their metaphysics.
Mm-hmm.
And the changelings happen to be the ones that are, what was it, tainted with human blood?
Yeah, they are. Okay, so it's rumored that some fairies have become so tainted with human blood that they have forgotten their fairy heritage. These fairies are called changelings by true fairies after the ancient practice of exchanging a fairy child with a human baby. Changelings can and do die, and if they are somehow cut off from fundamental power of the Fae, can also become wraiths.
Intriguing.
And fairies are generally feared because they are creatures of spirit and can easily make attacks across the shroud.
Oh my. Well, that would make for an interesting crossover game.
Yeah, and they give attributes 753, 1395 for abilities, Pathos 8, Willpower 7, Corpus 7, Angst 6 out of 6.
For all the talk about changelings now being glass cannons, some of these old ones were quite fearsome.
Yeah, well, it's kind of funny though. Their stats are, like, their attributes and abilities are not. They're like starting character,
Yeah.
and not even with the bonus points or anything, but then they get a lot of the powers
Yeah.
and like a high pathos. So they were kind of. Those sound like glass cannons to me, like magical.
Mm.
Like a lot of oomph, but not a lot of. It's like they do their magic and that's about it, kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know in depth, and I mean those are you see that a lot in the antagonist blocks for various games. They'll just describe other things in their own stats, like you get mages described with vampire disciplines in various editions and stuff. So
Yeah. Well, generally, mages just give them whatever thaumaturgy paths you feel they deserve.
yeah, maybe some aspects,
Maybe some aspects. There is also, sort of the Krynos in the room is the Fianna, since they, from the get-go, have been sort of tied to this notion of, like, Celtic lore and having the fairy connection. And yet, when I went into Tribebook Fianna, which was quite close to the release of Changeling, so Changeling must have been pretty well developed by, spring '95 or whenever the book came out. And yet they're kind of as vaguely described as in any other Splat book. So they call them changelings, but they just say, beware the unseelie courts, and they call them the Fae with a capital F. And it's just very nebulous. So.
Well, it kind of makes sense to me. Like these books, first of all, just because when it was published, like there's, if you think about it, like, okay, yeah, Changeling came out in 1995 and you have another book in 1994, but it's not like they would have finalized writing the book for the most part, relatively hot in advance, depending on the length of the book and whatnot. And I don't actually know the structure of White Wolf at that point. Was like everybody in the same office, or was there a lot of contractors even back then?
I confess that I don't know. So.
Yeah, I don't know either. So yeah, we can get to publication stuff, but it doesn't seem, just with for a bunch of reasons, it doesn't seem too surprising that whoever wrote that Tribe book wouldn't have really known anything about Changeling development.
Yeah, that makes sense.
At that point.
There was a lot of crossover, is my understanding, for people who were internal to the office, but then if they had freelancers as well, they might not have been necessarily clued into the current state of everything.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to look into. I don't know, we could look at, that's kind of a real hard to find. I don't know if anybody can remember, but you can also get books that are delayed or something, so it was written maybe a year beforehand.
In any case, by the time the Mage 2nd edition core book came along, which was the month after Changeling 1st edition, all of the terms seem to have been in place. So in the antagonist block in the Mage book, it uses Kithane, it uses Glamour, it uses Freehold, and like all of these other concepts that have been very clearly spelled out by the time Changeling was released.
Yeah, it does seem like from the Wraith one's the one that's making me think the most of like, that just feels like somebody did contact, like they were into where Changeling development was, but it hadn't quite finalized. The other one seemed like, I'm not sure if how much they would have gotten into versus just making up stuff, and then whoever started working on Changeling the Dreaming would have drawn from that, right? Like that's where the
Yeah. Well, and we haven't, I don't think, mentioned the fact that it seems the initial plan was to release, at the time, Fairy before Ghost, as Wraith used to be called, and at some
yeah.
point they were swapped.
Oh wow, a World of Darkness game released in a different order.
I
What
know.
originally planned.
But I imagine that's in part because, and this is, shout out to Wraith the podcast. This is something that if they do a historical dive, they might get into. Because with wraiths or ghosts, I mean, you had the Giovanni for the vampires being introduced quite early on, so there was already a point of connection for bringing that in, and you had necromancy as a discipline. And I wonder if when they were developing the two, because they had all of this pre-existing Ars Magica stuff for Fairy, that they then had to kind of deconstruct and make more playable in a modern context. Maybe that's what delayed Changeling. Whereas for Wraith, they said, oh, well, we can just take spirit rules and make them dead and add some Arcanoi.
I mean, I don't think Wraith was quite so straightforward either. Like, if I were to do a straightforward Ghost game, I don't think it would be. There's a lot more to the setting as well for that one.
Well, as a non-player, I'm biased. Or whatever the opposite of biased is. Biased, but the other way.
Yeah. No, but I just mean there is a lot of complexity. Just like in the Wraith write-up of Changeling, it's like, okay, they have changelings, kind of. They have, maybe it was supposed to be rumors, it's hard to tell, but and they do have like something like the Forgetting, and the Chrysalis seems maybe not exactly the same, something like the Chrysalis seems like it's in there. But they also have the Faeries being super active separate from the Changelings, which would almost make it feel more like Changeling the Lost as well. Like your main antagonists may have been the Faeries when you were playing a Changeling.
Or Dark Ages Fae, even. Overall, what would you say are the defining characteristics of Faeries before Changeling within the World of Darkness?
Well, there's definitely the elemental aspect. There's being mysterious and kind of scary and capricious. Immortality. There's a lot about Arcadia that just keeps coming up. But like as an active place where the fairies are, not just like a distant land. How about you? Do you have any?
Yeah, I think those definitely. And maybe, I suppose I would call it the diversity was there. There was this recognition of the many different kinds of fairies that were fundamentally different from each other in a way that maybe vampires or werewolves or mages weren't.
Yes.
Because when you think about vampires functionally are the same. They differ in the disciplines that they have and their clan weakness, but otherwise they function very similarly to each other. Werewolves, they have their auspices, they have their different gifts and everything, but they are fundamentally similar to each other. Mages are humans that follow different creeds.
Yeah. Oh, and wraiths as well are very like that too. There's it's even less. They're even the guilds are even less. It's strictly like, you've learned from this guild to learn these powers. It's not a splat at all, really, in that same way.
Whereas with the Fae, it's almost like they're made of entirely different material. A water fairy is derived from water. A fire fairy is derived from fire, and those are completely different from each other. So there seems to be, and not that was carried over, but that seems to be kind of an underlying piece of the puzzle.
Maybe not to that extreme amount. And I mean, even if you're just talking about the Kithane, they are still very distinct, much more so.
Yeah.
We can get into that when we get to the first core, but they are, I think they kept through to Changeling the Dreaming of, again, maybe not quite to the same extent, but still very distinct.
Yeah.
Which is also why you get so many Kiths eventually.
Yes. And they seem to acknowledge the sort of drawing from lots of different bodies of folklore as well, which I like. I like that they had that in mind, even though there was certainly primacy given to the Celtic and the Northern and Western European.
Yep.
So with all that kind of in the background, how does that sort of change your impressions of where Changeling came from as a game, if at all?
I think, yeah, it does. I do think they were trying. I get the impression they did try to play, like they were doing play testing with much more closer to, say, the Ars Magica or whatever in other iterations that we're going through, and went, this just doesn't work. Like, I don't know if it got to play testing or just got to trying to make a system and was like, no, this doesn't work. It's a PC system as much. But even though Ars Magica has PC system, but there's definitely a lot of, and they want to keep it, it seems also like they were working on scaling back the power on it, because
at some point they must have invented banality.
Yeah. And yeah, that might have been in the Wraith write-up too. But it was still different. Like, it didn't seem like it killed. Oh no, wait, sorry. Ghosts and fairies share many characteristics. Both are creatures born of spirit and composed of magic. Both feel the weight of reality as it tries to erode their very existence. Both must congregate in forgotten places. Both are affected by the mortal world in various ways. And it does talk about them becoming static and whatnot. So yeah, I think, not that even banality was nailed down, that was fluctuating throughout the run of Changeling the Dreaming. It's been fluctuating. But yeah, it does seem like they were getting somewhere banality-ish. But let me go back over this. And what powers do they have? They have Phantasm. I don't think they have anything to do with, creativity or dreams.
Why would they need to absorb dreams when they live in Arcadia?
Yeah, exactly. But that doesn't say they don't have any kind of... I mean, it's not going to get into in Wraith, because, like, why would they be connected to humans? But it just... Yeah, the whole glamour, anything where we think of as glamour besides just magic doesn't seem really tied in either.
I have to wonder if at some point, like, if Satiros Brucato, for example, came over from, like, the Mage writer's room to where they were playtesting Ars Magica Fairy in the modern world of darkness and it wasn't working, and just kind of said, listen, everyone, we have this thing called Paradox we've been working on. Maybe you should come up with something like that. And that kind of made it more, literally brought it down to earth.
Well, it's like, if you think about the powers, you have blood drinking, right? And then you have Gnosis / Rage. Like, Gnosis would be like drawing spiritual energy. And then Mage is just quintessence, which is just straight up whatever. And then Wraiths are drawing from emotions, right? So, like, maybe the glamour came from it. Actually, maybe the Wraith development actually did inspire a lot of the Changeling stuff.
It's an interesting... I knew that there was the emotion connection for Wraiths, but I didn't realize that was like their sustenance.
Oh yeah, so briefly on Wraiths, like, they draw their good and their passions and their angst, which is both emotional ties. It's kind of, the passions are the ones you're willing to accept, and the angst is the passions that you're not really comfortable with yourself and your shadow draws on. And then also things involving memory and connection to things that are important to you and people that are important to you. Like, that's, so it's like passion, connection, memory are all the really what matters, and accepting yourself or not accepting yourself, like that. That's sort of all of what Wraith is.
Right on.
They even have harrowings, which are kind of like dark, twisted. In Mage terms, it'd be like dark, twisted seekings.
Yeah.
Where instead of, that's how you increase your power, it's how you keep from being consumed by oblivion.
Well, all right. It's sort of a feel-good game, I guess.
Yes. Oh, it's definitely the happiest game of the World of Darkness, I'd say.
Excellent.
But yeah, Changeling definitely drew a lot of the darkness from it, I think.
Well, sure.
Yeah.
And I do kind of resent when people, for two reasons I resent when people sort of say Changeling has no place in the world of darkness or doesn't fit in. Because, one, it can absolutely be dark in the same way that dreams are such an important theme for Changeling. So are nightmares. So are failed dreams or dreams deferred. All of that sort of stuff. And even dreams that aren't outright bad are confusing and destabilizing and mysterious. So there's plenty of room for the built-in themes of Changeling to be kind of in the mix. But then in comparison with the other games, I think having that contrast is important, because otherwise the World of Darkness would feel much too one note. You know, vampires are monsters. Vampires are blood-sucking parasites. Werewolves are doomed. Werewolves know that they are fighting a losing battle, and they're going to try to go out in a blaze of glory.
I mean, so are changelings, in a sense.
So are changelings, but
Yeah.
but they also, I would say, are having a little bit more fun on the way.
Yeah.
Wraith is, you know, a feel-good game in the most intense way. And mages, I mean...
Mages, if anything, are the least... They're still definitely dark. I still think they fit in. But like, if you had to pick one that was the least fitting in of the five, it'd probably be Mage. Of
Probably.
the darkness themes. Because, I mean, they're also changelings have the banality thing, which is still very fitting with the goth punk world of darkness. Like...
Absolutely. Yeah. So I do think that it was sensible of them to kind of move away from the original conception and make it more human. Because ultimately, I think that's the distinction between Faerie and Changeling as games, or as a proto game versus a complete game. That seems to be the primary thing that evolved. So yeah, I'm into that. And I think that it adds a dimension to the World of Darkness line that it needed.
Yeah, it does add color. Just those colors aren't all happy.
And literal color, as we can talk about when we get to our discussion of the core book. Anyway. Anything else historical that we should point out before the actual launch of the line?
Yeah, if you're listening to this and want to give us feedback, we'll at some point have a way for you to contact us. But if Ars Magica came from somewhere impressive and those had fairies, please let us know. Oh, the first ed was also done by Mark Ryan Hagen. So
he's a prolific sort.
Yeah, so yeah, it was definitely tied into the World of Darkness from the beginning.
Yeah. I mean, the sort of legendarium of the World of Darkness that I'm aware of is the Mark Ryan Hagen was working on Ars Magica. The Week Brothers were doing White Wolf magazine. They joined forces. They decided to do Ars Magica in the Modern Age, which became Mage, and then on the way to Gen Con, Mark Ryan Hagen had the idea for Vampire and developed that.
Oh, well, that is interesting. That I didn't realize. So that's interesting that it then took three. Like, it was the third game with Mage, not the, and was very different.
Yeah,
from like definitely has the Order of Hermes, which is sort of pulled whole cloth, but
and Vampire has the Tremere, so
yeah.
There were.
Well, I mean, yeah, but I don't think there's any other. I don't think the Virtual Adepts or
no.
Even the Verbena really showed up. Maybe the Verbena, something like it, but not the other, or the Technocracy for sure. I don't think any of that was really. I've never heard of anything about that Ars Magica.
Yeah,
but again, listeners, please let us know when we're wrong. That's
it's a learning process for us all.
Yes.
So I believe next time we will be doing a deep dive into the first edition Changeling core book, which is a riot of color and fun and lots of other emotions.
Yes, and that's still doing the deep dive myself right now and finding lots of things I thought I had read it before, and I think I must have skimmed it a bit, but setting-wise at least, I'm being very surprised by things, and that's going to be interesting to talk about.
We're gonna have to talk about cantrip cards. This is a thing that will need to be discussed.
Yeah. Oh, it was 1995. That's right around Magic Boom, wasn't it?
I know. Oh, it sure was. How fondly I remember. But that's a discussion for next time. I know it's still early days, and we haven't fully established sort of little things to do in this podcast. But I would like to perhaps share one final little excerpt, just because I was so charmed to find it in the Fianna Tribebook.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah,
with your blessing. So in the Tribebook, where it goes through stereotypes of different tribes, different groups, whatever, the Faeries section It says the fairies are our distant cousins, and some of them, those with human blood, are trapped here. They are the changelings, and they are in some ways like us. If you ever meet a fairy, remember you owe him, and he owes you. Stand by and protect them, but be warned, not all fairies are safe to be around. Beware the unseelie courts and their dark minions. However, immediately after this, and I suppose it closes the entire section, but it's just kind of stuck in there with fairies, we have the first, not even the sentence, the first several clauses of the book Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, which I never thought that I would see in a role-playing book. So we have, river run past even atoms, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation back to Howth Castle and environs. And if you know Finnegan's Wake, you know that it's a circular novel. The first half of that sentence is the last line of the book, so that you can just read it forever. But yeah, for some reason I find that a very appropriate sign-off when talking about the fairies. Like Finnegan's Wake, they are beautifully complex and completely inscrutable and often dangerous to be around.
Yeah.
So, on that note, I'm good. I'm done.
Okay.
Here come the outtakes. So, there's a fire truck going by. I apologize if that's coming through on my side. It means they found me.
We can always just... the fire department's coming after you? That's not good.
All right, they've moved
Something
on.
you need to tell us.
My pyretics has gotten out of control. Yeah, so for listeners, I live on a very busy street, and occasionally, even in my attempt at a soundproof booth, the noise of the city creeps in. Oh, here comes another one. Anyway, we might edit this out.
Break and then edit this. Yeah, let's just...
I think it's...
Wait.
We'll see if it's 2 fire trucks, and that's it. If there's a third one, then I might actually go and see what's going on.
Yep. At least leave your little cubby or whatever.
Podcasts are not worth dying for.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not like you're running a game or anything.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm hearing horns.
That was a good comedic honk. I'm just glad I don't live downtown Ottawa right now. But
oh yeah,
that's another story.
All right. It sounds like we're good. Okay. World of Darkness.